Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. It is still dark when you first become aware of the sound. A low murmur, soft and rhythmic, like breathing. It is the sound of 9,000 people sleeping, pressed together in houses that touch on every side, separated only by walls of mud and straw. There are no streets here, no alleys, no open squares where you might walk freely beneath the sky. This is a city built like a honeycomb, each dwelling stacked against the next, rising in gentle terraces across a broad plain. And you are waking inside one of them, in a place that will not have a name for another 9,000 years, a place that exists before writing, before metal, before the wheel. You are waking in Çatalhöyük, the oldest city you have never heard of. The first light comes not through a window, because there are no windows here. It comes from above, filtering down through a square opening in the roof, a shaft of pale grey that slowly pushes back the darkness. The air is thick with wood smoke. It curls and rises from the hearth built into the southern wall, where embers from last night's fire still glow a soft orange beneath a veil of ash. You can smell it, that ancient scent of burning oak and juniper, mingled with the earthier smell of the walls themselves, mud plaster mixed with chaff and water, dried hard as stone. Somewhere nearby you hear the soft scrape of a grinding stone. Someone has already risen. The day is beginning. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Now, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let the hum of electricity and the glow of screens recede into silence. Tonight we are traveling to a place that existed long before any of that was even imaginable. We are going to a settlement that thrived for nearly 1,400 years, longer than the entire history of the Roman Empire, longer than the span from the fall of Constantinople to today. And yet, most people have never heard its name. This is not Mesopotamia. This is not Egypt. This is not Jericho or Ur. This is older than all of them. This is the place where the idea of the city may have first taken root, in the fertile plains of what is now central Turkey, in the heart of ancient Anatolia. Çatalhöyük is a mystery. It is a city with no streets, a society with no kings, a culture that buried its dead beneath the floors where the living slept. It is a place where walls were painted with images of vultures and leopards and wild aurochs with massive curving horns. A place where obsidian black volcanic glass sharper than any modern surgical blade was carved into mirrors so that people could see their own faces for the first time in human history. It is a place that challenges everything we think we know about how cities begin, how societies organize themselves, and what it means to live together in numbers that had never been attempted before. Tonight, you will walk through this ancient world. You will wake in a house with no door, climb down a wooden ladder into a room lit only by firelight, and learn to navigate a city where the rooftops are the streets and the dead sleep beneath your bed. You will grind grain until your arms ache. You will watch as walls are plastered smooth and painted with hands dipped in red ochre. You will witness rituals we can only guess at, meanings we are still struggling to understand. And you will come to see this settlement, not as a collection of ruins beneath a grassy mound, but as a living, breathing place filled with people who laughed and mourned and dreamed, just as we do now. The story of Çatalhöyük is the story of a beginning. It is the story of what happened when humans first decided to stop wandering, to plant seeds instead of following herds, to build houses that would outlast a single season. It is the story of the Neolithic Revolution, that profound transformation when our ancestors stopped living as hunters and gatherers and began to live as farmers, as builders, as settlers. But it is also the story of something stranger, something we are only now beginning to understand. It is the story of a society that chose a different path, one that did not lead to palaces and kings, to temples and priests, to the rigid hierarchies that would define every civilization that came after. For 14 centuries the people of Çatalhöyük lived in a settlement of nearly equal homes, with no evidence of rulers or ruled, no grand monuments to power, no city walls to defend against enemies. How they managed this, and why it eventually came to an end, is one of the great questions of archaeology. The settlement itself is gone now, buried beneath a great earthen mound that rises 30 meters above the Konya plain. Grass grows on its slopes. Wild flowers bloom in spring, If you were to stand there today, you would see nothing but a hill, one among many scattered across the Turkish landscape. But beneath that soil, layer upon layer, are the remains of hundreds of houses, thousands of lives, centuries of accumulated history pressed together like pages in a book. Archaeologists have been excavating this mound for more than 60 years, carefully peeling back the layers, and they have uncovered only a fraction of what lies beneath. What they have found has rewritten our understanding of the ancient world. So settle in now. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day fall away. We are about to step back across 9 millennia, to a time before bronze, before pottery wheels, before anyone had ever written a single word. We are going to a place where the line between the sacred and the everyday was not yet drawn, where art and life were inseparable, where the ancestors were not distant memories but physical presences, their bones resting just beneath the packed earth floor. We are going to Çatalhöyük, the city that time forgot, and we are going to spend the night there, living as they lived, seeing what they saw, understanding, as much as we can, what it meant to be human in the earliest days of settled life. Close your eyes. The smoke is rising through the roof. The first birds are beginning to sing. And you are there, in the darkness before dawn, in a house made of mud and hope, in the oldest city you have never heard of. You do not wake to an alarm. You do not wake to sunlight streaming through a window. You wake because the woman near the hearth has begun to grind grain, and the sound of stone on stone fills the small room with a rhythmic scraping that pulls you gently from sleep. Your eyes open to darkness. The only light comes from the square opening directly above you, a patch of deep blue fading to grey, and from the faint glow of the hearth fire that has burned low through the night. The air is cool against your face, but beneath the woolen blanket and the sheep hides piled over you, your body is warm. You lie still for a moment, oriented by sound and smell rather than sight. The house is approximately 6 meters by 5, though you would not measure it that way. It is the size it needs to be. Large enough for a family, small enough to heat with a single fire. The walls rise smooth and white around you, plastered with a mixture of mud and finely chopped straw, burnished until they shine dully in the firelight. Above you, blackened roof beams span the width of the room, supporting a layer of reeds and then packed earth. Everything here is made from the materials of the plain itself, earth and grass and wood, transformed by human hands into shelter. The platform where you sleep is not a bed as you might imagine. 1. It is a raised section of the floor, built up with layers of packed clay and rubble, covered with reed mats and hides. It runs along the northern wall, and it is where the family sleeps together, sharing warmth through the cold nights of winter. But this platform serves another purpose, one you have known since childhood but rarely speak of. Beneath it, beneath the very place where you rest your head each night, are the dead. Your grandmother is there. Your infant brother who did not survive his first winter. An uncle whose name you still speak in rituals. Their bones rest in the earth just below you, wrapped in textiles or reed mats placed carefully into shallow pits dug through the floor. They are not gone. They are here, part of the house itself, part of the foundation of your life. As your eyes adjust to the dimness, you begin to make out the details of the room. The southern wall, where the hearth sits in a plastered alcove, is the center of domestic life. The fire is built directly into the wall, a small depression lined with clay, with a hood above, to channel the smoke upward toward the roof opening. Next to the hearth is the oven, a domed structure of clay where bread will be baked later in the day. The heat from both hearth and oven warms this side of the house, while the sleeping platform on the opposite wall remains slightly cooler, better for rest. Everything is arranged with purpose. Nothing is random. On the eastern wall there is something that catches the faint light. It is a plastered relief, a shape that emerges from the wall itself as if growing out of it. The head of an orcas, a wild bull, rendered in clay and plaster with horns that curve upward toward the ceiling. The horns are real, massive things, taken from a bull that was hunted on the plains beyond the settlement. They have been set into the wall, plastered over, and painted, so that they seem to watch over the room with a presence that is both protective and unsettling. There are other markings on the walls, patterns in red ochre and black charcoal, geometric designs whose meanings you understand without needing to explain them. They are part of the language of the house, a visual grammar that speaks of seasons and hunts and things beyond the everyday. You sit up slowly, careful not to disturb the others who are still sleeping. A child is curled against the wall, breathing softly. An older man, perhaps your father or grandfather, lies on his side with his back to the room. The woman at the hearth does not look up from her work. She is kneeling before a large flat stone, a quern, and in her hands is a smaller stone shaped to fit her palm. She rocks it back and forth over a handful of grain, crushing the kernels between the two surfaces, with a motion that has been repeated every morning, for as long as this settlement has existed. The sound is meditative, almost musical. It will continue for hours. The only entrance to this house is above you. There is no door in any of the walls. To leave, you must climb. A wooden ladder leans against the southern wall, its top resting just below the roof opening. The ladder is worn smooth from use, the rungs darkened by thousands of touches. You reach for it now, placing your bare feet on the lowest rung, feeling the solid weight of the wood. As you climb, the smoke from the hearth rises around you, and you pause to let it pass, holding your breath against its acrid sting. Then you emerge into the open air. The rooftop is still in shadow, but the sky above is beginning to lighten. Stars are fading. The air is cold and sharp, scented with smoke from 100 hearths just like yours, all releasing their morning fires into the dawn. You stand on the roof of your house, and all around you, extending in every direction, is the roof of the next house, and the next, and the next. This is the city. There are no streets below, no pathways between buildings. The houses are built wall to wall, each one sharing its structure with its neighbors, so that the entire settlement is a single continuous mass of mud, brick, and timber. To move through Çatalhöyük is to move across its surface, stepping from rooftop to rooftop, climbing down ladders into the homes of neighbors, emerging again into the open air. It is a city turned inside out, where the public space is above and the private space is below. Other people are beginning to appear. A man climbs out of a house 3 roofs away, carrying a basket. A woman emerges with a clay pot balanced on her hip. Children scramble up ladders with the ease of long practice, their laughter sharp and bright in the stillness. You can see the whole settlement from here, or at least the part of it that is your immediate world. The houses descend in gentle terraces toward the river to the east, each roof slightly lower than the one behind it, creating a stepped landscape that mirrors the slope of the land beneath. Smoke rises everywhere, thin columns that merge into a haze that hangs over the settlement like a veil. You move carefully across the roof, stepping over the low walls that mark the boundaries between one house and another. Some roofs have small platforms built on them, places to sit or work in the daylight. Others have storage areas, ceramic jars sealed with clay stoppers, containing grain or dried lentils or preserved meat. You pass a house where someone has left a pile of reeds, probably gathered from the marshes to the north, waiting to be woven into mats or baskets. Everything has its place, everything has its use. The settlement is waking fully now. You can hear voices, low and conversational, drifting up from the houses below. You can hear the bleating of sheep and goats from the pens at the edge of the settlement, where the animals are kept at night for safety. You can hear the distant sound of water, the river that runs through the plain, the source of life for everything that grows here. And beneath it all, always, is that rhythmic sound of grinding, stone on stone, the heartbeat of the community, the sound of survival. You make your way toward the center of the settlement, where the houses are larger and more densely packed. There is a house here that is different from the others. From the outside, it looks much the same. The same mud brick walls, the same flat roof. But those who live nearby know that inside the walls are covered with paintings. Not simple patterns, but images of animals and humans, scenes of hunts and gatherings, rendered in vivid reds and blacks and whites. This house is not a temple. There are no temples here, but it is a place where certain rituals occur, where the community comes together for feasts and ceremonies that mark the turning of the seasons. You have been inside it only a few times, and each time the images on the walls seem to move in the firelight, the painted bulls charging, the hunters running, the vultures spreading their wings. The sun is rising now. The first rays of light strike the eastern edge of the settlement, turning the mud brick walls from gray to gold. The temperature is beginning to warm, though it will be hours before the full heat of the day arrives. You stand for a moment, looking out across the rooftops, watching the settlement come to life. This is your world. These houses, these people, this rhythm of waking and working and sleeping. You have never known anything else. You do not know that one day, thousands of years from now, archaeologists will carefully excavate these very roofs, these very walls, and try to understand what it was like to live as you are living now. You do not know that your house, your life, will become a mystery to be solved. You only know the present moment, the cold air on your skin, the smell of bread beginning to bake, the sound of your neighbors calling to one another across the terraces. And now it is time to descend back into the house, to begin the work of the day, to take your place in the ancient rhythms that have sustained this settlement for generations. The ladder awaits, the hearth fire glows. Life continues as it has for centuries, in the city with no streets, in the houses with no doors, in Çatalhöyük. To understand Çatalhöyük is to understand that it was built according to a logic that seems alien to us now. When we think of cities, we think of streets and avenues, of public squares and private homes clearly separated by walls and gates. We think of a grid, a plan, a rational order imposed upon space. But Çatalhöyük was not built this way. It was built organically, house by house, each new dwelling constructed directly against the last, until the entire settlement became a single continuous structure, a labyrinth of rooms connected not by corridors but by proximity. To live here was to live in constant contact with your neighbors, separated from them by a wall no thicker than your forearm, hearing their voices, smelling their cooking fires, sharing the very bones of the buildings themselves. The houses were made of mud brick, thousands upon thousands of rectangular blocks molded from clay and straw and dried in the sun. These bricks were not fired in kilns, as they would be in later civilizations. They were simply shaped and left to harden, becoming strong enough to support the weight of walls and roofs, but forever vulnerable to water. Rain was the great enemy of Çatalhöyük. When the winter storms came, the walls would begin to soften, the corners would erode and the people would have to replaster and repair, a constant cycle of maintenance that kept the settlement alive. Over time, as houses collapsed or were deliberately demolished, new houses would be built on top of the ruins, using the old walls as foundations. This is why the settlement grew upward as well as outward, layer upon layer, generation upon generation, creating the great mound that archaeologists would one day excavate with painstaking care. Each house was built to the same basic plan. A rectangular room, roughly 6 by 5 meters, with a hearth and oven in the southern wall, sleeping platforms along the north and east walls, and storage bins built into the corners. The roof was flat, supported by heavy wooden beams that spanned the width of the room. These beams were precious. Trees were not abundant on the Konya plain, and timber had to be carried from distant mountains or traded from neighboring communities. Once in place, the beams would remain for the life of the house, blackened by years of smoke, carved with marks that might have been signatures or prayers or simply the idle scratches of children. The roof itself was a complex structure. First came a layer of reeds, woven tightly together to form a mat. Then came a layer of packed earth, thick enough to insulate the room below, but light enough not to collapse the beams. The earth was carefully graded so that rainwater would run off toward the edges where it would drip down onto the lower roofs or into channels that carried it away from the settlement. The roof opening, the only source of light and ventilation, was placed off-center, usually toward the southern end of the room, directly above the hearth. This created a natural chimney effect, drawing smoke upward and out while allowing fresh air to circulate. It was a simple system, but it worked. The houses could be surprisingly comfortable, warm in winter, cool in summer, as long as the fire was tended and the roof was maintained. But the most striking feature of these houses was the absence of doors. There were no doorways in the walls, no thresholds to cross, no way to enter, except from above. This meant that the ladder was not just a convenience but a necessity, the only link between the private interior and the public rooftop. Archaeologists have debated why this was so. Some suggest it was for defense, that entering from above made it harder for enemies to attack, though there is little evidence of warfare at Çatalhöyük. Others suggest it was a way of controlling access, of ensuring that only those who belonged to the household could enter, though this seems impractical for a community where cooperation was essential. Perhaps it was simply a matter of space. By building walls without openings, the houses could be packed more tightly together, maximizing the use of the limited area within the settlement. Or perhaps it had symbolic meaning, a way of separating the domestic realm from the communal, the private from the public, in a culture where those boundaries were constantly negotiated. Whatever the reason, the result was a settlement unlike any other. To move through Çatalhöyük was to engage in a kind of vertical choreography, climbing up and down, stepping from roof to roof, balancing on the narrow walls that separated one house from another. Children must have been extraordinarily agile, scrambling across the rooftops like squirrels. The elderly and infirm must have faced great difficulty, confined to their houses unless helped by others. And in winter, when the roofs were slick with ice or covered in snow, the danger of a fall must have been ever present. Yet this system persisted for more than 1,000 years, which suggests that it served the needs of the community in ways that are not immediately obvious to us. The rooftops themselves became a kind of shared space, a place where the community could gather and interact without entering one another's homes. It was here that much of the daily work of the settlement took place. Women would sit in groups, grinding grain together, the rhythm of their stones synchronizing into a communal pulse. Children would play, their games spilling across the terraces. Men would repair tools, knap obsidian into blades, weave baskets from river reeds. And in the evenings, as the sun set and the cooking fires were lit, people would sit on their roofs and talk, their voices carrying across the settlement, creating a tapestry of conversation that was the sound of the city itself. The houses were not identical, but they were remarkably similar. Archaeologists have found little evidence of social stratification at Çatalhöyük, no palaces or mansions that would indicate the presence of an elite class. The largest houses are only slightly bigger than the smallest, and they contain much the same kinds of objects, the same tools, the same pottery, the same obsidian blades. This suggests a society that was, if not entirely egalitarian, at least far more equal than the civilizations that would follow. There were no kings here, no priests with temples, no merchants with vast storehouses. There were simply families, living side by side, sharing the labor and the resources and the risks of settled life. But this does not mean the houses were all the same. Each one was decorated according to the tastes and beliefs of the people who lived there. Some had simple geometric patterns painted on the walls, white chevrons, or red spirals that might have represented abstract concepts or simply pleased the eye. Others had elaborate reliefs, sculpted figures that emerged from the plaster like ghosts. The most common of these were the bukrania, the plastered heads of aurochs or wild bulls with real horns mounted in the walls. These were not casual decorations. The aurochs was a massive and dangerous animal, standing nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder, with horns that could span a meter or more. To hunt one required courage and skill, and to bring its head into the house was to bring a piece of that wild power into the domestic space. Some houses had multiple bukrania, arranged in rows along the walls, creating an atmosphere that must have been both awe-inspiring and slightly menacing. Other houses had different images: leopards rendered in relief and painted in spots of black and ochre, vultures, their wings spread wide, sometimes shown in the act of attacking headless human figures. These images have been the subject of intense scholarly debate. Were they religious symbols, clan totems, records of actual events, or were they simply art, expressions of a creative impulse that needed no deeper meaning? We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that the people of Çatalhöyük lived surrounded by these images, that they saw them every day, that they plastered over them and repainted them in an annual cycle of renewal that suggests they were deeply important. The walls were not static. Each year, or sometimes more frequently, the houses would be replastered. This was a communal effort, a ritual as much as a practical task. The old plaster would be smoothed over with a new layer of mud, creating a fresh white surface. If there were paintings, they would be redone, the designs traced out again in ochre and charcoal. If there were reliefs, they would be rebuilt, the forms sculpted anew. Over time, this created walls that were incredibly thick, built up from dozens or even hundreds of layers of plaster, each one a snapshot of a particular moment in the life of the house. When archaeologists excavate these walls, they can peel them back layer by layer, like the pages of a book, and see how the decorations changed over time, how images were added or removed, how the house evolved as the family evolved. This architecture of connection, this city with no streets, this community of houses built wall to wall and roof to roof, was the physical expression of a particular way of life. It was a life of proximity and interdependence, where privacy was limited and cooperation was essential. It was a life where the boundaries between self and other, between my house and your house, between the living and the dead, were fluid and permeable. And it was a life that required a kind of social cohesion that is difficult for us to imagine today. A willingness to live in constant contact with others, to share space and sound and smell, to be always aware of the presence of the community around you. As you move across the rooftops in the growing light of morning, you are not just navigating a physical space. You are moving through a web of relationships, a social landscape where every house is connected to every other, where every family is part of a larger whole. This is the genius and the challenge of Çatalhöyük, a city built not for individuals but for a community, a settlement where the architecture itself enforced a kind of collectivism that would shape every aspect of life. The work begins before the sun is fully risen. You climb back down the ladder into the house, your hands familiar with the smooth wood, your feet finding the rungs without thought. The interior is warmer now, the fire built up with fresh wood, the oven heating for the morning bread. The woman who was grinding grain has moved on to other tasks, and now it is your turn to take up the stone and continue the work. This is the foundation of life at Çatalhöyük. This daily transformation of hard kernels into flour, of wild grasses tamed and cultivated into wheat and barley into the substance that will sustain you. You kneel before the quernstone. It is a flat slab of basalt, dark grey and slightly porous, its surface worn into a shallow depression by years of use. The grinding stone that you hold in both hands is smaller, oval-shaped, smooth on one side from constant friction. You pour a handful of wheat kernels onto the quern, a golden cascade that spreads across the stone. Then you begin to push and pull, rocking the handstone back and forth, crushing the grain between the two surfaces. The sound is immediate and rhythmic. A scraping, gritty music that fills the room. Your shoulders begin to work, your arms finding the motion, your back bending to the task. This is not easy work, it is exhausting. The wheat resists, each kernel hard and resilient, requiring real force to break. You lean your weight into it, pushing down as you push forward, letting gravity and muscle combine to do what needs to be done. Slowly, the kernels begin to crack and split. Small fragments of husk and endosperm scatter across the stone. You gather them back to the center and grind again, and again, and again. Minutes pass. Your arms begin to ache. Sweat forms on your brow despite the cool air. But you cannot stop. A family needs bread every day, and bread requires flour, and flour requires this endless grinding that can take 3 or 4 hours to produce enough for a single day's baking. The wheat that you are grinding was harvested months ago, during the late spring when the fields turned gold and the entire community went out to bring in the crop. You remember that time, the heat of the sun, the scratch of the chaff against your skin, the rhythm of the sickle cutting through the stalks. The grain was brought back to the settlement in baskets and stored in large ceramic jars, some kept in the house, others in communal storage areas on the rooftops. It is the product of an entire year's labor, from the plowing of the fields with wooden adze pulled by oxen, to the planting, the weeding, the watering, in dry spells, the protection from birds and rodents, the careful timing of the harvest before the grain could shatter and fall to the ground. Agriculture is not a simple thing. It is a complex web of knowledge and effort, a gamble against weather and pests and the uncertainties of nature. But it is also what makes this settlement possible. Without cultivated grain, there could be no Çatalhöyük. When the flour is finally ground fine enough, you sweep it into a clay bowl. There is already water in another vessel, and you begin to mix, adding the flour gradually, kneading it with your hands into a sticky dough. There is no yeast here, no rising agent, except what might occur naturally from wild yeasts in the air. The bread will be flat, dense, nourishing, but not light. You shape the dough into round cakes, patting them between your palms until they are thin enough to cook quickly. The oven is ready now, its interior radiating heat. You reach in with a wooden paddle and slide the bread onto the hot clay floor of the oven. It will bake in minutes, and the smell that will fill the house is one of the most comforting in the world. The smell of bread, of sustenance, of home. But bread is not the only food. There are lentils and peas, small and hard, that must be soaked overnight and then boiled into a thick porridge. There are vegetables gathered from the gardens that surround the settlement, onions and garlic and bitter greens. There is meat, though not every day. The people of Çatalhöyük keep sheep and goats, small herds that are grazed on the plain and brought back at night to pens at the edge of the settlement. Occasionally, an animal is slaughtered, and the meat is distributed, shared among families in a system of reciprocity that ensures no one goes hungry when food is available. The bones are not wasted. They are split for their marrow, boiled for broth, carved into tools and needles and ornaments. Nothing is discarded that can be used. And then there is the wild game. The men of the settlement still hunt, venturing out onto the plain with spears and bows to track the animals that have lived here for millennia. The aurochs, those massive wild bulls, are the most prized but also the most dangerous. A successful hunt is an event, a moment of celebration and feasting, and the horns of the beast are brought back to be mounted in the walls, a permanent record of courage and skill. There are also deer and boar, wild horses and onagers, birds and hares and foxes. The hunt is not just about food, it is about maintaining a connection to the older way of life, the way of the ancestors who did not plant crops or tend herds but lived by reading the land and following the seasons. As the morning progresses, the house fills with activity. A young girl sits in the corner, learning to weave on a simple loom, her fingers clumsy but determined as she passes the shuttle back and forth, creating a strip of fabric from wool thread. An older woman works with a bone needle and sinew, stitching together pieces of leather that will become a garment or a bag. A man kneels by the hearth, working a piece of obsidian with a small stone hammer, carefully napping off tiny flakes to create a blade so sharp it can cut through hide and flesh with almost no resistance. Each person has their task. Each task is essential, and together they form the economy of the household, the small-scale production that keeps the family clothed and fed and equipped for life. The division of labor is not rigid, but there are patterns. Women do most of the grinding and much of the weaving, tasks that are time-consuming and can be done while watching children or tending the fire. Men do more of the hunting and the heavy work of building and repairing houses. But these are tendencies, not rules. Everyone knows how to do most things. Survival requires versatility, and there is no sense, as far as archaeologists can tell, that some work is more valued than other work. The person who grinds the grain is as essential as the person who hunts the aurochs. The person who weaves the cloth is as important as the person who shapes the obsidian blade. The obsidian itself deserves special attention. It is one of the great treasures of Çatalhöyük, a material that is both beautiful and functional, prized for its sharpness and its rarity. Obsidian is volcanic glass, formed when lava cools so quickly that crystals do not have time to form. It is black or dark gray, sometimes with a slight translucence, and when it is fractured, it creates edges that are sharper than any metal blade, sharper even than modern surgical steel. The nearest sources of obsidian are volcanic mountains more than 100 kilometers away, and the fact that the people of Çatalhöyük have access to it in such abundance speaks to the existence of trade networks that span vast distances. The process of working obsidian, called knapping, is a skilled craft. You cannot simply hammer obsidian into shape. It is too brittle, too prone to shattering. Instead, you must learn to read the stone, to understand how force will travel through it, to strike at precise angles with precise pressure to remove flakes in a controlled way. A master napper can create a blade in minutes, a series of careful strikes that peel away long, thin flakes until what remains is a tool of extraordinary sharpness and utility. These blades are used for everything, from butchering animals to harvesting crops to cutting leather and wood. They can be attached to wooden handles to make knives or mounted in rows to create sickles, and when they become dull, they can be resharpened by removing more flakes or simply discarded and replaced. Obsidian is valuable, but it is not so rare at Çatalhöyük that it must be hoarded. There is another use for obsidian, one that is less practical but perhaps more profound. Some pieces are polished until they become mirrors, smooth black surfaces that reflect light and images with startling clarity. To hold an obsidian mirror is to see your own face, perhaps for the first time in your life, to confront your own image as an object, something separate from yourself. We cannot know what this meant to the people of Çatalhöyük, whether they found it unsettling or enlightening or simply curious. But the mirrors have been found in burials, placed with the dead as grave goods, which suggests they had significance beyond mere vanity. The day moves forward. The bread is baked and eaten warm from the oven with a little sheep's milk cheese and some dried apricots traded from a distant village. The fire is tended, fed with small pieces of wood and dried dung that burn slowly and hot. The loom clicks. The needle pierces. The obsidian rings against stone. Outside on the rooftops, life continues in its communal rhythm. Someone is repairing a section of roof, laying fresh reeds and packing new earth. Someone else is dyeing wool in a pot, the water turning a deep red from madder root. Children chase each other, their laughter bright and careless, oblivious to the labor that surrounds them. And beneath it all, always, is the awareness of the dead. They are not ghosts. They are not separate from the living. They are part of the house, part of the foundation, part of the continuity that makes this place home. You sleep above them. You walk across the floors where they rest. And when the time comes, when a member of the family dies, they too will be placed beneath the floor, another layer in the archaeology of kinship, another body in the earth that supports the living. This is the rhythm of life at Çatalhöyük, a rhythm of work and rest, of making and using, of birth and death, all woven together in a pattern that has sustained this community for centuries and will sustain it for centuries more. As evening approaches and the light begins to fade, you find yourself drawn to one of the houses at the heart of the settlement. This is not your house, but you have been here before during ceremonies and feasts that mark the turning of the seasons. From the outside it looks like any other dwelling, the same mud brick walls, the same ladder rising to the roof opening. But inside the walls are alive with images. You descend the ladder carefully, the smoke from the hearth already thick in the air below. The fire is larger than usual, built up for illumination as much as warmth, and in its flickering light the paintings on the walls seem to move. The first thing you see is a massive aurochs rendered in red ochre and black charcoal, its body filling an entire section of the western wall. The proportions are not quite realistic, the horns slightly too large, the body slightly too compact, but there is a power to the image that makes your breath catch. This is not a picture of an aurochs. This is the essence of aurochs, the strength and danger and wild vitality captured in pigment and plaster. Next to the aurochs is a scene of hunters. They are small figures, depicted in a simplified style, little more than stick forms with bows and spears, but their arrangement tells a story. They are surrounding a stag, their weapons raised, working together to bring down prey that is larger and faster than any individual. This is the old way, the way of cooperation and patience and reading the movements of the herd. Above the hunters, painted in a reddish-brown, are geometric patterns that might represent the landscape or the sky, or concepts that have no modern translation. They are part of the visual language of Çatalhöyük, a grammar of symbols that everyone here understands, but that will be lost to time. The most striking images are on the northern wall. Here, rendered in vivid detail, are vultures. They are enormous, their wings spread wide, their beaks curved and sharp, and beneath them are human figures. But these figures are headless, their bodies are intact, arms and legs splayed out, but where the heads should be there is nothing. The vultures seem to be descending upon them, or perhaps rising from them, and the overall effect is both disturbing and strangely beautiful. This is not a scene of violence, this is a scene of transformation, of death as a necessary passage, of the body returning to the earth and the sky through the agency of birds. These images are not random. They are part of a belief system, a way of understanding the world and the place of humans within it. The people of Çatalhöyük practiced excarnation, a form of burial that involved exposing the dead to the elements and to scavengers before the bones were finally laid to rest beneath the floors. This might seem shocking to us, accustomed as we are to immediate burial or cremation, but it was a practical and meaningful practice. By allowing vultures and other birds to strip the flesh from the bones, the community ensured that the process of decomposition happened quickly and cleanly, without the smell and disease that could accompany corpses left to rot in enclosed spaces. And it was also a symbolic act, a giving back of the body to the natural world, a recognition that death was not an ending but a transformation. The vulture paintings are a record of this practice, a visual reminder of the path that every person will eventually take. They are educational, instructional, a way of teaching the young about the cycle of life and death, but they are also reverential, honoring the vultures as sacred creatures, agents of transition, necessary participants in the great pattern of existence. To sit in this room and look at these images is to be reminded of your own mortality and of the community's commitment to handling death with dignity and purpose. Other walls have other images. There are leopards, their spotted coats rendered in careful detail, their mouths open to show sharp teeth. Leopards were real animals on the Anatolian plain 9,000 years ago, predators that posed a genuine threat to sheep and goats, and even to humans who wandered too far from the settlement at night. But in these paintings they are more than just animals. They are symbols of power and danger, of the wild world that exists beyond the cultivated fields and the safety of the houses. They are a reminder that Çatalhöyük is not isolated, that the boundary between civilization and wilderness is thin and permeable. Some walls have handprints, dozens of them, stamped in red ochre, the fingers splayed wide. These are not accidental marks, they are deliberate, the hands dipped in pigment and pressed firmly against the wet plaster. Whose hands are they? Individuals who lived and worked and died here, whose identities are lost but whose presence remains. Each print is unique, the lines of the palm, the length of the fingers, the size of the hand. They are signatures, claims of presence, assertions that I was here, I existed, I touched this wall. And in a culture without writing, without names carved in stone, these handprints are one of the few ways that individuals could leave a mark that would outlast their lives. The plastering of the walls is not a casual act. It is a ritual, performed annually or sometimes more frequently, a way of renewing the house and the images it contains. The old plaster is smoothed over with a new layer, and then the images are repainted, sometimes exactly as they were before, sometimes with small variations, sometimes with entirely new compositions. This creates a palimpsest, a layered record of the house's history, each layer representing a moment in time, a decision about what to remember and what to erase. When archaeologists excavate these walls, they can peel them apart, layer by layer, revealing earlier paintings, earlier handprints, earlier visions of the world. It is like reading a book written over centuries, each page a snapshot of a particular moment in the life of the community. The colors themselves are significant. Red ochre, the most common pigment, is made from iron oxide, ground into a fine powder and mixed with water or animal fat to create a paint. It is the color of blood, of earth, of life itself. Black charcoal comes from burned wood, collected from the hearth and crushed into powder. White is made from limestone or gypsum, materials that must be quarried and processed. To create these paints requires effort and knowledge, an understanding of chemistry and geology that is intuitive rather than scientific, but no less real. The act of painting is not just decorative. It is a way of transforming the raw materials of the earth into meaning, of imposing order and beauty on the chaos of existence. In the center of the room, set into the floor, is a large ceramic vessel partially buried in the earth. It contains grain, a communal store that will be drawn upon when individual families run low. Next to it is a basket filled with obsidian blades, more than any single household would need, suggesting that this house serves some kind of communal function. There are no priests here, no dedicated religious specialists as far as archaeologists can determine. But there are people who know the rituals, who lead the ceremonies, who maintain the traditions. They are not set apart from the community. They live in houses like everyone else, grind grain like everyone else, bury their dead like everyone else. But they have a role, a responsibility to preserve the knowledge and the practices that hold the community together. As you sit in this painted room, surrounded by images of bulls and vultures and leopards and hands, you feel a connection to something larger than yourself. This is not just a house, it is a sacred space, a place where the boundary between the everyday and the eternal becomes thin. The fire casts shadows that make the paintings seem to breathe, the aurochs charging, the vultures flying, the hunters running. You can almost hear the sounds of the scenes depicted, the bellowing of the bulls, the beating of wings, the shouts of men in pursuit of prey. And you understand, in a way that does not require words, that this is what it means to be part of Çatalhöyük, to live in a world where art and life are inseparable, where the walls of your house are canvases for the deepest truths you know. The decorated walls are not unique to this house. Many houses have paintings, though most are simpler, geometric patterns or small figures rather than elaborate scenes. But the principle is the same. The house is not just a shelter. It is a statement, a declaration of identity and belief and connection to the past. Each time the walls are replastered and repainted, the family is renewing their commitment to these truths, passing them down to the next generation, ensuring that the knowledge and the beauty will not be lost. As the evening deepens and the fire begins to burn low, you climb back up the ladder to the roof. The stars are coming out, bright and cold in the clear sky. The settlement is quieting, the sounds of work and conversation fading into the murmur of people settling in for the night. You make your way back across the rooftops, stepping carefully in the darkness, guided by the faint glow of hearth fires visible through the roof openings below. And when you reach your own house, you descend into the familiar warmth, the familiar smells, the familiar presence of family and ancestors. The walls here are simpler, just white plaster and a few red chevrons, but they are yours, and that is enough. You lie down on the sleeping platform, pull the wool blanket over you, and let the sounds of the settlement lull you towards sleep. Beneath you the dead are resting, above you, the stars are turning, and all around you, the community breathes as one, alive and present and enduring in the oldest city you have never heard of. There comes a time, as it must, when someone in the community dies. Perhaps it is an elder, worn down by the accumulated labor of a long life. Perhaps it is a child, taken by fever or accident before their potential could be realized. Perhaps it is someone in the prime of life, killed in a hunting accident or a fall from a rooftop. Death is not abstract here. It is immediate and present, a constant companion in a world where medicine is limited and danger is never far away. And when death comes, the community responds with rituals that are both practical and profound. Rituals that bind the dead to the living in ways that will persist for as long as the house stands. The first step is the exposure of the body. This is done outside the settlement, in a designated area where the vultures and other scavengers gather. The body is carried out before dawn, wrapped in textiles or reed mats, and placed on a platform or simply laid on the ground. Family members may stay nearby for a time, watching as the birds descend, witnessing the transformation that is about to occur. This is not a time of horror or revulsion, though it might seem so to modern sensibilities. This is a time of acceptance, a recognition that the body is no longer the person, that the essence of who they were has already departed, and that what remains is simply matter to be returned to the cycle of nature. The vultures come quickly. They are large birds with wingspans that can exceed 2 meters, and they are efficient. Within hours, sometimes within a single day, the flesh is stripped from the bones. What the vultures do not take, other scavengers will finish, foxes and ravens and insects working together to complete the process. The family returns later, perhaps after several days, to collect what remains. The bones are clean now, white and dry, and they are carefully gathered and wrapped again. This is what will be brought back to the house. These skeletal remains that once formed the framework of a living person. The burial takes place beneath the floor. A section of the sleeping platform is chosen, usually along the northern wall where the family sleeps, and a shallow pit is dug through the packed earth. This is hard work, chipping away at the clay and rubble with stone tools, creating a space just large enough to receive the body. The bones are arranged carefully, sometimes in anatomical position as if the person were sleeping, sometimes in a flexed or bundled position to save space. Grave goods are placed with them, objects that might be needed or valued in whatever comes next. A necklace of shell beads, an obsidian blade, a polished stone, a clay figurine. Some burials are more elaborate than others. Individuals who were important to the community, or who died in particularly significant ways, might be given more goods, more care in the arrangement of the bones. But there is no evidence of vast disparities in burial wealth. No tombs filled with gold and treasures as there would be in later civilizations. Even the richest burials at Çatalhöyük are modest by the standards of pharaohs and emperors. This suggests again that the society was relatively egalitarian, that status differences were real but not extreme, and that everyone was entitled to a burial that honored their humanity. Once the bones and goods are in place, the pit is filled in and the floor is replastered. Within hours the surface is smooth again, indistinguishable from the rest of the platform, but everyone in the house knows what is beneath. The children are told, the knowledge is passed down. This is where grandmother rests. This is where the baby who did not survive his first winter was laid. This is where uncle was buried after the aurochs hunt that went wrong. The dead are not in a distant cemetery separated from the living by walls and distance. They are here, beneath your feet, beneath your bed, part of the very structure of the house. This practice has profound implications. It means that every house is also a tomb, that the domestic space and the sacred space are one and the same. It means that the ancestors are not absent, but constantly present, literally supporting the living, their bones forming part of the foundation upon which daily life is built. And it means that the house itself becomes a repository of memory, a physical archive of the family's history, each burial a chapter in the ongoing story of kinship and continuity. Over time, as generations pass and more burials accumulate, the houses become crowded with the dead. Some houses have dozens of individuals buried beneath their floors, layer upon layer of skeletons creating a stratified record of lineage. This may be one reason why houses were periodically abandoned and new ones built on top. When the number of burials became too great, when the floors had been dug and replastered so many times that they were unstable, it might have been time to close the house, to fill it in and build anew above it. The old house would become a tomb in truth, sealed and left undisturbed, while the new house rose on its ruins, continuing the cycle. Archaeologists have been able to reconstruct some of the faces of the people buried at Çatalhöyük. By taking the skulls and using forensic techniques to build up layers of clay and plaster in the same way that muscle and skin would have layered the bone in life, they have created portraits of individuals who lived 9,000 years ago. These are not generic representations. They are specific people with distinctive features, high cheekbones or broad noses or strong jaws. Looking at these reconstructed faces is a strange and moving experience. These were real individuals with thoughts and feelings and fears and hopes, and now they stare back at us across the millennia, reminding us that the past was not populated by abstractions but by human beings as real and complex as we are. Some skulls were treated differently. In certain burials, the skull was removed from the body before interment and kept separate, sometimes plastered and painted to restore the features of the face. These plastered skulls have been found in various contexts, sometimes buried alone, sometimes placed in walls or beneath floors in ways that suggest they were objects of veneration. The practice of removing and preserving skulls is found in many Neolithic cultures, and it speaks to a belief that the head was the seat of identity, the part of the body that most fully represented the person. To keep a skull was to keep the essence of the individual, to maintain a connection with them that was more than just memory. The grave goods buried with the dead offer clues to what the people of Çatalhöyük believed about the afterlife. The presence of tools and ornaments suggests that they thought the dead would need or want such things in whatever realm they inhabited next. The obsidian mirrors, in particular, are intriguing. Why would a dead person need a mirror? Perhaps it was believed that the ability to see oneself, to have self-awareness, was something that continued beyond death. Or perhaps the mirrors were not functional but symbolic, representing knowledge or insight, or a connection to the spiritual world. We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that these objects were valuable, that burying them meant removing them from circulation among the living, and that this sacrifice was considered worthwhile. The burial of children is especially poignant. Infant mortality was high in the Neolithic world, and many of the burials at Çatalhöyük are of babies and young children. These small bodies were placed in the floors with as much care as adults, sometimes with tiny beads or shells as grave goods, sometimes with nothing but the love and grief of their families. The placement of these burials beneath the sleeping platform means that parents continued to sleep above their lost children, night after night, year after year, held in a kind of perpetual closeness that might have been comforting or heartbreaking or both. Death at Çatalhöyük was not the end of relationship. It was a transformation of relationship, a shift from the visible presence of the living person to the invisible presence of the ancestor. The dead were consulted, honored, remembered. They were part of the household's identity, part of its claim to place and belonging. To live in a house was to live with its dead, to be constantly aware that you were part of a chain of being that extended backward into the past and forward into the future. And when your own time came, when the vultures had done their work and your bones were gathered and placed beneath the floor of the house you had lived in, you too would become part of that foundation, part of the weight and substance that supported the generations yet to come. This intimacy with death, this physical proximity to the bones of ancestors, shaped the culture of Çatalhöyük in ways that are difficult for us to fully grasp. We live in a world where death is often hidden, managed by professionals, removed from daily life. But for the people of this ancient settlement, death was always present, always near, a constant reminder of the fragility of existence and the importance of community. The living and the dead were not separate realms but intertwined realities, and the house was the place where that intertwining was most complete, where the past and the present met beneath the plastered floors and the painted walls. Among all the materials that flowed through Çatalhöyük, none was more prized or more ubiquitous than obsidian. This volcanic glass, dark as midnight and sharp as thought, was the physical manifestation of wealth and connection in the Neolithic world. To hold a piece of obsidian was to hold a fragment of distant mountains, a material that had traveled across landscapes and through the hands of traders, finally arriving in this settlement on the Kanya Plain. It was a reminder that Çatalhöyük was not isolated, that it was part of a larger world, connected by invisible threads of exchange and relationship to places and people far beyond the horizon. The obsidian came from volcanoes. The nearest sources were the peaks of Gulu Dağ and Nenezi Dağ, more than 130 kilometers to the east, rising from the Cappadocian highlands. These were places of power and strangeness, where the earth itself had once erupted in fire and ash, leaving behind flows of molten rock that cooled into glass. The people who went to these mountains to gather obsidian were not casual visitors. They were specialists, individuals who knew the landscape, who understood where the best deposits could be found, and who had the skills to extract the material and carry it back across difficult terrain. Some scholars believe that certain families or groups within Çatalhöyük controlled access to these sources, creating a network of relationships that gave them influence and prestige. Others think the obsidian trade was more open, with multiple groups competing and cooperating to bring the material to the settlement. The obsidian arrived in various forms. Some pieces were rough nodules, irregular chunks of volcanic glass that would need to be worked before they could be used. Others were already partially shaped, cores or blanks that had been prepared at the source to reduce the weight that needed to be carried. And some were finished blades, ready to use, crafted by master knappers who had honed their skills over years of practice. The presence of all these forms at Çatalhöyük suggests that obsidian was being both imported and worked locally, that the settlement was not just a consumer of this material but a producer, a place where raw stone was transformed into tools of extraordinary utility and beauty. The process of knapping obsidian is both an art and a science. It begins with understanding the material itself, the way it fractures, the angles at which force must be applied, the sound it makes when struck correctly. Obsidian is brittle. If you hit it too hard or at the wrong angle, it will shatter into useless fragments. But if you strike it precisely, with controlled force, it will release long, thin flakes, sharp as razors, that can be used immediately or further refined. The napper sits with the core held steady, often braced against a leather pad on the thigh, and uses a hammerstone or an antler punch to strike blow after careful blow. Each strike sends a shock wave through the glass, and each flake that comes away changes the shape of the core, creating new ridges and angles for the next strike. A skilled napper can produce dozens of blades from a single core, each one a testament to their understanding of geometry and material properties. The blades are not uniform. Some are wide and thick, suitable for heavy cutting tasks. Others are narrow and delicate, perfect for fine work like cutting leather or carving bone. And some are so thin and sharp that they seem almost translucent, light passing through the dark glass to reveal bands of color, browns and grays and hints of deep red. These exceptional blades might be kept for special purposes, used in rituals or given as gifts to cement relationships with other families or other settlements. The obsidian tools were essential to daily life. They were used to butcher animals, to cut meat from bone with a precision that stone axes could never achieve. They were used to harvest grain, mounted in wooden handles or set in rows along the edge of a sickle, their sharp edges slicing through the wheat stalks cleanly and quickly. They were used to scrape hides, to cut textiles, to carve wood and bone, and when they became dull, which happened quickly with use, they could be resharpened by removing more flakes or simply discarded and replaced. The abundance of obsidian at Çatalhöyük meant that people did not have to conserve their blades the way they might have in a place where stone was scarce. They could use them freely, knowing that more were available, either from the stockpiles in the houses or from the knappers who were constantly producing new ones. But obsidian was not just functional. It was also beautiful, and the people of Çatalhöyük recognized this. Some pieces were polished to create mirrors, smooth black surfaces that reflected light and images with startling clarity. The process of polishing obsidian is labor-intensive. It requires rubbing the surface with finer and finer abrasives, sand and then silt, and then perhaps crushed shell, until all the rough edges and scratches are worn away and what remains is a surface as smooth as water. The result is an object of remarkable beauty, a piece of volcanic glass that has been transformed into something new, a tool for seeing. These obsidian mirrors are among the most evocative artifacts from Çatalhöyük. To hold one is to imagine holding it as its original owner did, lifting it to your face and seeing your reflection for perhaps the first time in your life. In a world without polished metal, without glass windows, without any of the reflective surfaces we take for granted, a mirror was a profound object. It allowed you to see yourself as others saw you, to become aware of your face as an object, separate from your sense of self. This must have been a strange and possibly unsettling experience. Who is that person looking back at me? Is that really what I look like? The mirrors have been found in burials, carefully placed with the dead, which suggests they had significance beyond mere vanity. Perhaps they were thought to allow the dead to see themselves in the afterlife, or to see their ancestors, or to perceive realms that were invisible to the living. The trade in obsidian connected Çatalhöyük to a wide network of settlements across Anatolia and beyond. Archaeologists have been able to trace the source of obsidian artifacts by analyzing their chemical composition, a technique that can determine which specific volcano the glass came from. What they have found is that obsidian from Cappadocian sources has been discovered at sites hundreds of kilometers away on the Mediterranean coast, in the Levant, even as far as Cyprus. This means that the people of Çatalhöyük were not just receiving obsidian from the mountains, they were also trading it outward, acting as middlemen in a network of exchange that spanned the ancient Near East. What did they receive in return? We cannot know for certain, because many of the goods traded in the Neolithic world were perishable and have not survived. But we can make educated guesses. Textiles woven from wool or plant fibers, leather goods, tanned and crafted into bags or clothing, food items, dried fruits or nuts or honey, shell beads, brought from the Mediterranean or the Red Sea, prized for their beauty and their exotic origin, pigments for painting, ochre and malachite and other minerals that could be ground into powder and mixed with fat to create colors. And perhaps, though we have no direct evidence, stories and songs and knowledge, the intangible goods that travelers carry with them, the news of distant places and people, the information that allows a community to understand its place in a larger world. The economics of this trade were not like the economics we know today. There was no money at Çatalhöyük, no coins or currency that could be accumulated and stored. Exchange was based on reciprocity, on gift-giving and obligation, on building relationships that could be called upon when needed. If you gave obsidian to a trader from a coastal village, you were not just making a transaction. You were creating a bond, a connection that might be renewed year after year, that might involve your children and grandchildren, that might one day bring you shells or salt or the help you needed in a time of crisis. This kind of economy requires trust and memory, a social infrastructure that can track debts and favors over long periods of time. And it requires a certain egalitarianism because extreme wealth disparities would undermine the reciprocity that holds the system together. The abundance of obsidian at Çatalhöyük is one of the reasons scholars believe the settlement was prosperous. The fact that so much of this valuable material was available, that people could afford to discard blades that were only slightly dull, that mirrors and other luxury items were relatively common, all suggest a community that had access to resources beyond mere subsistence. This prosperity was not based on agriculture alone. It was based on the settlement's position in a network of trade, its ability to obtain obsidian from the volcanic highlands and distribute it to other communities, to transform raw materials into finished goods and exchange them for things that could not be produced locally. Çatalhöyük was not just a village of farmers, it was a node in a web of commerce and connection, a place where the local and the distant intersected, where the products of the earth and the products of human skill came together to create wealth and security. And yet, despite this prosperity, there is little evidence of hoarding or accumulation. The houses of Çatalhöyük do not contain vast stockpiles of obsidian or other valuables. The goods seem to have been distributed relatively evenly, shared among families in ways that prevented any single household from dominating the others. This is part of the mystery of Çatalhöyük, the question of how a community of this size and complexity managed to maintain such a degree of equality for so long. Perhaps the answer lies in the obsidian itself, in the fact that wealth at Çatalhöyük was not about accumulation but about circulation, not about holding on to things but about giving them away, creating relationships, building networks of reciprocity that bound the community together more tightly than any walls or laws ever could. One of the most remarkable things about Çatalhöyük is what is not there. There are no palaces rising above the other houses, no grand residences that would indicate the presence of a ruling class. There are no monumental temples, no massive structures devoted to gods or priests. There are no fortifications, no walls encircling the settlement to protect it from enemies, and there are no clear signs of hierarchy, no evidence of kings or chiefs, or a rigid social order that divided people into rulers and ruled. For 14 centuries, the people of Çatalhöyük lived in a settlement of nearly equal houses, governed by systems we can barely glimpse, sustained by a collective commitment to cooperation that challenges our assumptions about how large communities organize themselves. The houses, as you have seen, are remarkably similar. They vary slightly in size, some a bit larger, some a bit smaller, but the differences are minor. The largest houses are perhaps 20% bigger than the smallest, a variation that could easily be explained by family size rather than wealth or status. And the contents of the houses are similarly uniform. Every household has grinding stones and obsidian blades, pottery and baskets, textiles and tools. Some houses have more elaborate wall paintings or more bukrenia, but these differences do not seem to correlate with other markers of wealth or power. A house with painted walls might be no bigger than a house with plain walls. A house with multiple bullheads might contain no more grain or obsidian than a house with none. This uniformity is striking because it is so unusual. In almost every other early civilization we know of, settlement size and social stratification went hand in hand. As populations grew and communities became more complex, hierarchies emerged. Leaders arose to organize labor and distribute resources. Elites accumulated wealth and power. Palaces and temples were built to house and honor them. This pattern is so common that it has been seen as almost inevitable, a natural consequence of urbanization. But Çatalhöyük does not fit this pattern. It is a settlement of several thousand people, a proto-city by any measure, and yet it shows little evidence of the hierarchies that supposedly accompany urban life. How did they manage this? How did a community of this size make decisions, coordinate activities, resolve disputes, and maintain cohesion without centralized authority? The answer is that we do not know for certain. The people of Çatalhöyük left no written records, no laws carved in stone, no accounts of their governance systems. What we have are the physical remains, the houses and burials and artifacts, and from these we must infer the social structures that organized daily life. But we can make some educated guesses based on what we see and what we know about other societies that have operated without formal hierarchies. One possibility is that decisions were made collectively through some form of consensus or council. Perhaps the elders of different families would gather to discuss issues affecting the community, debating and negotiating until agreement was reached. Perhaps there were regular assemblies where all adults could participate, voicing their opinions and voting on important matters. This kind of direct democracy is known from other small-scale societies, and it can be remarkably effective as long as the population is not too large and the issues not too complex. Çatalhöyük may have been near the upper limit of what such a system could manage, but it is not impossible. Another possibility is that authority was dispersed rather than concentrated. Instead of a single leader or a ruling class, there might have been multiple sources of influence, different individuals or groups who had expertise or prestige in different areas. Some people might have been respected for their skill in hunting or knapping obsidian. Others might have had knowledge of rituals and ceremonies. Still others might have been valued for their wisdom in resolving conflicts or their ability to remember and recite the stories and traditions of the community. In such a system, power would be situational and context-dependent, shifting from person to person depending on the need of the moment, and no one individual could dominate all aspects of life. The religious life of Çatalhöyük also seems to have been decentralized. There are no temples, no buildings set apart exclusively for worship or ritual. Instead, the sacred and the domestic are intertwined. The houses themselves are the sites of ritual, with their painted walls and plastered skulls and burials beneath the floors. This suggests that religious authority was not monopolized by a priestly class, but was distributed among families and households, each responsible for maintaining their own relationship with the ancestors and the powers that governed the world. There may have been individuals who were particularly knowledgeable about rituals, who led ceremonies or taught others, but they would have been part of the community rather than set above it. The distribution of food and resources also seems to have been relatively egalitarian. Analysis of bones from burials shows that people at Çatalhöyük had similar diets regardless of which house they lived in or where they were buried. There are no skeletons that show signs of malnutrition, alongside others that show signs of excessive consumption. Everyone seems to have had access to a similar mix of grains and meat and vegetables, suggesting that food was shared broadly rather than hoarded by elites. This does not mean that everyone had exactly the same amount at all times. There would have been variations based on family size, individual circumstances, good fortune and bad. But the overall pattern is one of sharing and redistribution, of ensuring that no one went hungry while others feasted. The absence of fortifications is another clue to the social structure of Çatalhöyük. Walls and defenses require organization and labor, and they usually reflect a society that is concerned about external threats or internal divisions. The fact that Çatalhöyük had no walls suggests that it did not face significant military threats, or that it had other ways of dealing with such threats. Perhaps the settlement's size itself was a form of defense, a deterrent to raiders who would have thought twice before attacking a community of several thousand people. Or perhaps the people of Çatalhöyük maintained relationships with neighboring settlements, alliances and networks of reciprocity that reduced the likelihood of conflict. In any case, the lack of fortifications meant that resources and labor could be devoted to other things, to building houses and producing food and creating art, rather than to defending against enemies. What sustained this equality for so long? Partly, it may have been the economic system, based on reciprocity and gift exchange, rather than accumulation and hoarding. In such a system, wealth is not something you keep, but something you circulate, and prestige comes not from having more than others, but from being generous, from giving gifts that create obligations and strengthen relationships. This kind of economy works against the concentration of wealth because accumulating resources without redistributing them would be seen as antisocial, a violation of the norms that hold the community together. Partly it may have been the ideology, the beliefs and values that shaped how people thought about themselves and their place in the community. The wall paintings and burials suggest a worldview that emphasized connection over hierarchy, the collective over the individual, the continuity of generations over the ambitions of any single person. In such a worldview, the idea of setting yourself above others, of claiming special privileges or authority, might have been not just impractical but almost unthinkable, a betrayal of the fundamental truths that everyone understood. And partly, it may have been simple pragmatism. A settlement of several thousand people living in houses with no doors, where everyone is constantly in sight and earshot of everyone else, where privacy is minimal and transparency is enforced by the architecture itself, is not a place where it would be easy to accumulate secret wealth or exercise covert power. Everyone would know if you were taking more than your share. Everyone would see if you were trying to dominate others. The physical layout of Çatalhöyük may have functioned as a kind of social control mechanism, making hierarchy difficult to establish or maintain simply because everything was so visible. But this equality was not total. There were differences among people, differences in skill and knowledge and prestige, differences that mattered even if they did not translate into formal rank or permanent status. And there are hints in the archaeological record that toward the end of Çatalhöyük's long history, these differences may have been beginning to harden into something more like hierarchy. Some of the later houses are slightly larger and more elaborately decorated than the earlier ones. Some burials contain more grave goods. These changes are subtle, but they suggest that the egalitarian system that had sustained the community for so long may have been starting to break down, that pressures both internal and external were pushing toward the kind of stratification that would characterize later civilizations. But for most of its existence, Çatalhöyük stands as a remarkable example of what is possible. It shows that large communities can organize themselves without kings or priests, that prosperity can be shared rather than concentrated, that cooperation can be sustained over centuries without the need for coercion. It is a vision of an alternative path, a road not taken in the long march toward the hierarchical states and empires that would dominate human history. And it raises the question, why did this path not continue? Why did the egalitarian experiment of Çatalhöyük not become the template for civilization? The answer may lie in the forces that eventually brought the settlement to its end, forces that we are only beginning to understand. The spiritual life of Çatalhöyük was not separate from daily existence, but woven through every aspect of it. There were no temples here, no priests standing apart from the community in special robes. There were no sacred texts, no dogmas carved in stone. Instead, there was a way of being in the world that infused the ordinary with meaning, that saw the divine not in distant heavens but in the earth beneath your feet, in the animals that shared the plain, in the ancestors whose bones rested beneath your sleeping platform. To understand the religion of Çatalhöyük is to understand a time before religion had become formalized, institutionalized, separated from the rhythms of life itself. The most famous religious artifacts from Çatalhöyük are the female figurines. These small sculptures, carved from clay or stone, depict women with exaggerated features, large breasts and bellies and hips, often seated or giving birth. When they were first discovered in the early excavations, archaeologists immediately interpreted them as representations of a mother goddess, a fertility deity worshipped by the people of the settlement. This interpretation fit neatly with theories popular at the time, theories that suggested all Neolithic societies were matriarchal, governed by women and devoted to feminine deities. The most famous of these figurines, known as the Seated Woman of Çatalhöyük, shows a full-figured female seated on a throne flanked by two leopards, her hands resting on their heads, appearing to give birth or about to give birth. But modern scholarship has become more cautious about such interpretations. The figurines are diverse, not uniform. Some depict women, yes, but others depict men or animals or abstract forms. Some are clearly associated with domestic contexts, found in houses among ordinary household goods. Others are fragments, broken and discarded, which suggests they were not treated with the reverence we might expect for images of a deity. And the idea that all female figurines must represent a goddess, rather than individual women, or symbolic representations of fertility and life, or even toys or teaching tools, is now seen as overly simplistic. The truth is that we do not know what these figurines meant to the people who made them. They may have had religious significance, or they may have been purely secular, or they may have occupied some middle ground where the sacred and the everyday were not yet clearly distinguished. What we can say is that the figurines reflect a concern with fertility and procreation, which makes sense for an agricultural society that depended on both the fertility of the land and the fertility of human bodies to survive. The exaggerated features, the emphasis on breasts and bellies, may have been a way of celebrating or invoking the power of creation, of ensuring that crops would grow and children would be born and the community would continue into the future. But whether this concern rose to the level of worship, whether there were rituals and prayers addressed to a goddess or goddesses, is something we cannot determine from the physical evidence alone. The bukrania, the plastered bull heads mounted on walls, suggest a different aspect of religious life. The aurochs was a powerful and dangerous animal, and hunting one was an act of courage and skill. To bring the horns into the house and fix them to the wall was to capture something of that power, to make it part of the domestic space. Some scholars have suggested that the bull represented male fertility or masculine power, a counterpart to the female figurines, creating a symbolic balance between masculine and feminine principles. Others have seen the bukrania as totems, markers of clan identity or lineage, each set of horns representing a connection to a particular ancestor or founding figure. Still others think they may have been records of successful hunts, a kind of visual archive of the family's achievements and prowess. The leopards that appear in wall paintings and reliefs are equally mysterious. Leopards were real predators on the Anatolian plain, animals that could kill livestock and even threaten humans. But in the art of Çatalhöyük, they seem to have a significance beyond mere representation. They are often depicted in pairs, symmetrically arranged, and they appear in contexts that seem ceremonial or symbolic. The seated woman figurine has leopards at her sides, suggesting a connection between the female figure and these powerful animals. Perhaps the leopard was seen as a guardian or a guide, a creature that could move between the human world and the wild, between the domesticated settlement and the untamed plain. Or perhaps it was a symbol of danger and power, a reminder that the world outside the houses was filled with forces that could destroy as well as sustain. The vulture paintings are perhaps the clearest evidence we have of specific religious beliefs. The depiction of vultures descending on headless human bodies is almost certainly a reference to the practice of excarnation, the exposure of corpses to scavengers before burial. This was not just a practical matter of disposing of the dead, it was a ritual, a transformation, a way of returning the body to the natural cycle while preserving the bones for burial beneath the house. The vultures were not symbols of death or decay, but agents of transformation, necessary participants in the passage from life to death to ancestorhood. To paint them on the walls was to honor them, to acknowledge their role, to incorporate them into the sacred geography of the house. Feasting seems to have played an important role in religious and communal life. Some houses at Çatalhöyük show evidence of large-scale food preparation and consumption, more than a single family would need. These may have been the sites of communal gatherings, occasions when the entire community or a significant portion of it came together to eat and drink and celebrate. Feasts are known from many cultures as occasions for ritual and social bonding, times when the ordinary rules of life are suspended and people come together in a spirit of abundance and generosity. At Çatalhöyük, feasts might have marked seasonal transitions, the planting or the harvest, the beginning of the new year. They might have been held to honor the dead, to celebrate births or marriages, to renew social bonds or resolve conflicts. The preparation and consumption of large quantities of food would have required cooperation and sharing, reinforcing the values of reciprocity and community that held the settlement together. There is evidence of what might be shamanic practices. Some burials contain unusual objects, bones of birds or small animals, collections of unusual stones, items that might have been tools or talismans for individuals who served as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. Shamanism, in its broad sense, involves the belief that certain individuals can enter altered states of consciousness and communicate with spirits or ancestors or gods, bringing back knowledge or healing or guidance for the community. Whether such practices existed at Çatalhöyük is uncertain, but the diversity of burial goods and the presence of enigmatic objects suggest that some individuals had roles or abilities that set them apart, even in a largely egalitarian society. The integration of sacred and domestic space is one of the most distinctive features of religion at Çatalhöyük. The house was not just a shelter, it was a temple, a tomb, a canvas for sacred art, a place where the living and the dead coexisted, where daily tasks like cooking and weaving took place beneath walls painted with images of gods or ancestors or powers beyond naming. This integration meant that religion was not something you did at specific times in specific places. It was something you lived, constantly, in every action and every moment. The grinding of grain, the plastering of walls, the burial of the dead, all of these were acts that had both practical and spiritual dimensions, that connected you to the past and the future, to the community and the cosmos. The absence of monumental religious architecture is significant. In later civilizations, temples and ziggurats and pyramids would rise as statements of religious and political power, massive structures that required the labor of thousands and the authority of kings and priests. But at Çatalhöyük, there was nothing like this. The sacred was not concentrated in a single building or controlled by a religious elite. It was dispersed throughout the community, present in every house, accessible to every family. This suggests a form of religious life that was communal and participatory, where everyone had a role, where knowledge and practices were shared rather than hoarded, where the relationship with the divine was direct and personal rather than mediated by institutions. And yet there must have been specialists, individuals who knew more than others, who could perform rituals correctly, who understood the meanings of the images and the symbols, who could intercede with the ancestors or the spirits on behalf of the community. But these specialists did not constitute a separate class. They lived in the same houses, ate the same food, were buried in the same way as everyone else. Their authority came from knowledge and skill, not from institutional position, and it was probably limited to specific contexts rather than extending to all areas of life. The nature of Neolithic spirituality is one of the great mysteries of archaeology. We can see the artifacts, the paintings, the burials, but we cannot hear the prayers or the songs. We cannot know what people believed about the origins of the world, about what happened after death, about the forces that governed the seasons and the harvests. We can only infer from the physical traces they left behind, and those traces are ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. What seems clear is that the people of Çatalhöyük lived in a world that was alive with meaning, where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was porous, where animals and ancestors, and perhaps gods or spirits, moved through daily life as tangible presences. It was a world we have largely lost, a way of being that was displaced by the rise of organized religions and secular modernity. But it was real once in this settlement on the Anatolian plain, and the echoes of it remain in the painted walls and the buried bones, waiting to be understood. Nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not cities, not even a settlement that has endured for 1400 years. Around 5700 BCE, after more than a millennium of continuous occupation, the people of Çatalhöyük began to leave. It was not a sudden exodus, not a catastrophic abandonment driven by war or earthquake or plague. It was gradual, a slow decline in population, a dwindling of the community over generations until the last houses were finally empty, and the settlement became what it would remain for the next 7,500 years. A great earthen mound rising above the plain, silent and still, its stories buried beneath layers of soil and time. Why did they leave? The answer is not written in any text, not recorded in any monument. It must be inferred from the archaeological evidence, from the patterns visible in the layers of earth and the bones and seeds and artifacts that have been excavated with such painstaking care. And what that evidence suggests is not a single cause but a convergence of pressures, environmental and social and perhaps spiritual, that made it increasingly difficult to sustain a community of this size in this place. One factor was almost certainly environmental degradation. For 14 centuries, the people of Çatalhöyük had been exploiting the resources of the Konya Plain, cutting trees for timber and fuel, grazing sheep and goats on the grasslands, diverting water for irrigation. This kind of sustained use leaves its mark on the landscape. Analysis of plant remains from the settlement shows a gradual shift in the species that were available. In the early periods, there is evidence of oak and juniper forests nearby, sources of timber and fuel. In the later periods, these species become scarce, replaced by shrubs and grasses that indicate a more degraded landscape. The forests had been cut down, and without trees to hold the soil, erosion would have increased, water sources might have become less reliable, and the overall productivity of the land would have declined. The impact on animal populations would have been significant as well. The aurochs and other large game that had once roamed the plain in abundance became rarer as their habitats were destroyed and hunting pressure increased. The people of Çatalhöyük were increasingly reliant on domesticated sheep and goats, which required grazing land and careful management. Overgrazing can quickly degrade pastures, turning grassland into scrub or even desert. And as the wild resources dwindled, the settlement would have become more vulnerable to bad harvests or disease among the livestock, events that in earlier times might have been buffered by hunting or gathering but that now could lead to genuine food shortages. There is also evidence of climate change during this period. Studies of lake sediments and pollen cores from the region suggest that the late Neolithic was a time of increasing aridity, with less rainfall and more droughts. This would have made agriculture more difficult, reducing crop yields and stressing the already degraded environment. In a landscape that was becoming drier and less productive, supporting a population of several thousand people would have been increasingly challenging. The community would have faced hard choices, rationing food, restricting access to resources, perhaps even conflicts over who got what and when. Population pressure is another likely factor. Çatalhöyük at its peak may have housed as many as 8,000 people, a staggering number for a Neolithic settlement. This density brought benefits: the security of numbers, the ability to organize large-scale labor, the richness of social and cultural life, but it also brought challenges. Disease would have spread more easily in such close quarters. Sanitation would have been a constant problem, with waste from thousands of people and animals accumulating faster than it could be managed. The houses themselves, built wall to wall with no space between, would have been breeding grounds for pests and parasites. And the sheer noise and crowding, the lack of privacy, the constant awareness of neighbors just a few meters away might have created social tensions that were difficult to resolve. There are hints in the later phases of the settlement that social cohesion was beginning to break down. Some houses show evidence of burning, not accidental fires but deliberate destruction, possibly the result of conflicts or vendettas. Some burials from this period contain fewer grave goods, suggesting that the systems of reciprocity and sharing that had sustained the community were weakening. And there is evidence of increased violence, skeletal remains that show signs of trauma, injuries consistent with interpersonal conflict. These are subtle signals, not proof of warfare or collapse, but they suggest a community under stress, struggling to maintain the egalitarian ideals that had defined it for so long. It is possible, too, that the very ideology that had sustained Çatalhöyük for so long was becoming less viable as conditions changed. The emphasis on equality and communal decision-making works well in stable times when resources are abundant and everyone benefits from cooperation. But in times of scarcity and stress, such systems can struggle. There may have been a need for more centralized authority, for leaders who could make quick decisions and enforce them, for hierarchies that could allocate resources efficiently even if unfairly. And if the community was unable or unwilling to adapt its social structures to the new reality, that failure might have contributed to its decline. Eventually people began to leave. They did not abandon Çatalhöyük all at once. Some families stayed longer than others, maintaining the houses and the traditions even as the settlement shrank around them. But over time, the population dwindled. Houses were left empty, their roofs collapsing, their walls slowly eroding. The fields were no longer cultivated. The sheep pens stood abandoned. And finally, the last family climbed down from their rooftop for the final time, gathered their possessions, and walked away, leaving behind the place that had been home to their ancestors for more generations than anyone could count. Where did they go? Some probably moved to nearby settlements, smaller villages that were springing up across the plain as the population dispersed. Others may have migrated further afield, carrying with them the knowledge and skills and stories of Çatalhöyük, spreading its influence even as the settlement itself was abandoned. The Neolithic world was a mobile one. Despite the transition to agriculture and settled life, people still moved, following opportunities, escaping difficulties, seeking better land or more favorable conditions. And as they moved, they took their culture with them, their ways of building and farming and worshipping, their obsidian and their pottery and their painted walls. The abandonment of Çatalhöyük was not an ending, but a transformation. The settlement itself fell silent, but its legacy lived on in the communities that succeeded it, in the techniques and traditions that would shape the development of Anatolian civilization for millennia to come. The idea of the city, the experiment in living together in large numbers, had been tested and proven possible, even if this particular city could not be sustained indefinitely. And the knowledge gained about agriculture and architecture, about social organization and art, about the possibilities and limitations of communal life, would inform every settlement that followed. As the years passed and the decades became centuries, the abandoned houses of Çatalhöyük slowly collapsed. Roofs caved in, walls crumbled, the carefully plastered surfaces flaked away. Wind and rain wore at the exposed mud brick, softening it, dissolving it back into the earth from which it had been made. Dust and debris accumulated in the empty rooms. Plants took root in the ruins, their roots breaking apart what the elements had weakened, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the settlement began to transform into a mound, a tell, a raised platform of human-made earth that rose above the surrounding plain. This process of mound formation is common at ancient sites in the Near East, where millennia of continuous occupation, building and rebuilding on the same spot, create artificial hills that can rise dozens of meters above the original ground level. At Çatalhöyük, the mound grew slowly, fed by the collapse of houses and the deposition of wind-blown soil, until it stood 30 meters high and covered 13 hectares, a great hump in the landscape, its origins forgotten, its stories silent. Grass grew on its slopes, wildflowers bloomed in spring, birds nested in its crevices, and beneath it all, perfectly preserved by the dry climate and the protective layers of earth, lay the remains of 14 centuries of human life, waiting in the darkness for someone to come and uncover them. For 7,000 years, Çatalhöyük lay undisturbed. Empires rose and fell. The Hittites built their capital at Hattusa, not far away. The Greeks and Persians and Romans marched across Anatolia, building cities and roads and temples. The Byzantine Empire held the land for 1,000 years. The Seljuks and then the Ottomans came, bringing Islam and a new culture. And through all of this, the mound remained, a feature of the landscape that local people noticed but did not understand. A hill that seemed natural but was in fact entirely human in origin. Shepherds grazed their flocks on its slopes. Farmers plowed the fields around it. Children played on its summit. And no one knew, no one remembered, that beneath their feet lay one of the oldest cities in the world, a place where the human experiment with settled life had been tried and tested and ultimately abandoned, leaving behind only silence and earth and the faint traces of lives long forgotten. The rediscovery of Çatalhöyük is a story of chance and persistence. of a British archaeologist with keen eyes and a willingness to look beneath the surface of an unassuming hill. In 1958, James Mellor was conducting a survey of the Konya Plain, searching for prehistoric sites. He had heard rumors of a large mound near the village of Çatalhöyük, and when he arrived to investigate, he was struck by its size and the pottery sherds scattered on its surface. These were not ordinary fragments. They were Neolithic, thousands of years old, and they suggested that something significant lay beneath the earth. Mellor returned in 1961 with a team and began to excavate. What he uncovered astonished the archaeological world. Beneath the grass and soil were the remains of houses, perfectly preserved, with walls still standing, hearths still intact, and paintings still visible on the plastered surfaces. He found the bucrania, the bull heads mounted on walls, and he found the female figurines, including the famous seated woman. He found obsidian in abundance, mirroring the faces of people who had been dust for millennia. And he found burials, dozens of them, tucked beneath the floors of the houses, the bones still articulated, the grave goods still in place. Mellor's excavations continued until 1965, when they were abruptly halted due to political complications and accusations of smuggling. But in those 4 years he had revealed enough to establish Çatalhöyük as one of the most important Neolithic sites in the world. His interpretations, particularly his emphasis on a mother-goddess cult and a matriarchal society, captured the public imagination and influenced a generation of scholars. But they were also controversial, based on assumptions that later archaeologists would question and revise. For nearly 30 years, the site lay dormant again, visited occasionally by scholars, but not systematically excavated. Then in 1993, a new project began under the direction of Ian Hodder of Cambridge University and later Stanford. Hodder's approach was different from Mellor's. He was interested not just in uncovering spectacular finds, but in understanding the site in its totality, in reconstructing the daily lives of the people who had lived there, in testing hypotheses with rigorous methods and interdisciplinary collaboration. He brought in specialists from dozens of fields, archaeologists and anthropologists, botanists and zoologists, chemists and geologists, artists and conservators. Together, they embarked on what would become one of the longest and most comprehensive excavations in the history of archaeology. The work at Çatalhöyük is painstaking. Mud brick is fragile, and distinguishing between different layers of construction, between walls and floors and fill, requires extraordinary care and patience. The excavators use trowels and brushes, working centimeter by centimeter, recording every feature, every artifact, every change in soil color or texture. They take samples of everything: seeds and bones, plaster and pigment, soil and ash. These samples are analyzed in laboratories around the world, revealing information about diet and environment, about trade networks and craft production, about health and disease and violence. The excavation is not just about digging. It is about reading the soil like a text, interpreting the traces left by people who lived 9,000 years ago, as if they were leaving messages for us to decode. One of the most striking aspects of the modern excavation is its commitment to preserving the site even as it is being uncovered. Çatalhöyük is fragile. Once exposed to the elements, the mud brick begins to deteriorate rapidly. Rain can dissolve walls in a matter of months. Sunlight can fade paintings. Temperature fluctuations can cause cracking and spalling. To protect what has been uncovered, the excavators have built shelters over the dig areas, large structures with transparent roofs that allow light in but keep rain and wind out. These shelters have become part of the site itself, monuments to the care and respect with which the past is being approached. The findings from the modern excavations have challenged and refined Mellor's interpretations. The emphasis on a mother-goddess cult has been questioned. The figurines, when analyzed in context, do not all seem to represent a single deity. Some may be images of individual women, perhaps ancestors or important figures. Others may be educational tools, used to teach about pregnancy and childbirth. And the idea of a matriarchal society, while appealing to some, is not strongly supported by the evidence. The society of Çatalhöyük seems to have been relatively egalitarian, but that does not necessarily mean it was matriarchal. Men and women may have had different roles, but those roles do not seem to have translated into hierarchical power structures. The excavations have also revealed new aspects of life at Çatalhöyük that Mellor did not fully appreciate. The importance of the rooftops as communal space. The complexity of the burial practices, with their selective removal of skulls and their careful placement of bodies, the evidence of environmental stress in the later periods of occupation, the subtle signs of social tension and conflict that suggest the egalitarian system was under strain. Each season of excavation brings new discoveries, new questions, new ways of understanding this remarkable site. One of the most challenging aspects of excavating Çatalhöyük is deciding what to dig and what to leave for the future. The site is vast, covering 13 hectares, and only a small fraction of it has been excavated. Archaeologists must balance the desire to learn more with the recognition that future techniques, future technologies, may allow for better preservation and more sophisticated analysis. Digging too much now might destroy evidence that could be invaluable to scholars 100 years from now. So the excavation proceeds slowly, carefully, with the understanding that this is not just about satisfying current curiosity, but about stewarding a resource that belongs to all of humanity, present and future. The site has become a destination for archaeologists from around the world, a place where new methods are tested and new theories are debated. It has also become a tourist destination, though access is carefully controlled to prevent damage. Visitors can walk through the excavation areas under the protective shelters, can see the houses and the paintings and the burials, can stand in the presence of something that is almost unimaginably old. The experience is profound. To be in a room where people lived 9,000 years ago, to see the marks of their hands on the walls, to stand where they stood and look through the same roof opening they looked through, is to feel a connection across time that is both humbling and exhilarating. The excavation of Çatalhöyük has also had an impact on the local community. The village of Çatalhöyük, after which the site is named, has benefited from the tourism and the employment opportunities created by the dig. Local people work as excavators, conservators, site guards, guides. They have a stake in the preservation and interpretation of the site, and their knowledge of the landscape and the climate is invaluable to the project. The excavation is not just an extraction of knowledge from the past. It is a collaboration between past and present, between international scholars and local communities, between science and storytelling. What remains buried at Çatalhöyük is far more than what has been uncovered. The excavated areas represent less than 5% of the total site. Beneath the grass and soil, there are hundreds of houses still waiting to be discovered, thousands of burials, countless artifacts. There are answers to questions we have not yet thought to ask, evidence that could transform our understanding of the Neolithic world. And there is also the possibility of surprises, of findings that challenge our assumptions, that reveal aspects of life at Çatalhöyük that we have not even imagined. The site is a time capsule, sealed and preserved, and every time it is opened, even just a little, it tells us something new about who we are and where we came from. The rediscovery and excavation of Çatalhöyük is one of the great archaeological achievements of the 20th and 21st centuries. It has given us a window into a world that was previously known only through fragments and speculation. It has shown us that the Neolithic was not a simple or primitive time, that the people who lived then were as complex and creative and thoughtful as we are. And it has reminded us that the past is not gone, that it is still here, beneath our feet, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to speak to us if we are willing to listen. The story of Çatalhöyük is still being written, one careful brushstroke at a time, and it will continue to be written for as long as there are people who care about where we came from and what it means to be human. And now, as the night deepens and our journey through time draws to a close, let us consider what Çatalhöyük teaches us, what it reveals about the human capacity for innovation and cooperation, and what questions it still leaves unanswered. Çatalhöyük stands as a testament to human ingenuity, in a place with no natural advantages, no rivers for easy transport, no forests for timber, no mountains for defense. A community of several thousand people created a thriving settlement that lasted for more than a millennium. They did this not through conquest or coercion, not by building armies or erecting monuments to kings, but through cooperation and shared labor, through the daily grinding of grain and the annual plastering of walls, through the patient accumulation of knowledge about crops and animals and the rhythms of the seasons. They built a city on mud and hope, and it worked. The settlement teaches us that cities do not require hierarchy. For most of human history, and certainly for most of recorded history, Cities and states have been synonymous with social stratification, with kings and priests and nobles set above peasants and slaves. This pattern is so ubiquitous that it has been seen as natural, inevitable, the only way that large numbers of people can live together. But Çatalhöyük shows us a different possibility. It shows us that a community of thousands can organize itself without kings, can create art and architecture and economic systems without the need for a ruling class. This does not mean it was a perfect society. There were still inequalities, still conflicts, still power dynamics that we can barely glimpse. But those dynamics were fundamentally different from the rigid hierarchies that would characterize later civilizations, and that difference matters. The settlement teaches us that the sacred and the secular were once unified. In our world, we separate religion from daily life, build churches and temples as special places set apart from ordinary existence. But at Çatalhöyük, the house was the temple, the hearth was the altar, and the dead were literally part of the foundation. This integration meant that spirituality was not something you practiced on special occasions, but something you lived every moment. It meant that meaning and purpose were woven into the fabric of existence, that every act from grinding grain to painting walls had significance beyond its immediate function. We have lost much of that integration in the modern world, and perhaps there is something we can learn from its presence in the ancient one. The settlement teaches us about our relationship with the environment. The people of Çatalhöyük were not living in harmony with nature, whatever that might mean. They were exploiting it, using it, transforming it to meet their needs. They cut down forests, they overgrazed pastures, they depleted resources, and eventually those choices caught up with them, contributing to the decline and abandonment of the settlement. This is a pattern that has repeated throughout history, from the Maya to Easter Island to our own modern civilization. The lesson is not that we should return to a pre-agricultural past, but that we need to think carefully about sustainability, about the long-term consequences of our actions, about how to live in a place without destroying the very resources that make life possible. The settlement teaches us about the power of art. The paintings on the walls of Çatalhöyük were not decorations. They were statements of identity and belief, records of knowledge and experience, tools for teaching and remembering. They were created not by professional artists, but by the people who lived in the houses, individuals who ground the pigments and mixed them with fat and applied them to wet plaster with fingers and brushes made from reeds. This democratization of art, this integration of creative expression into daily life, produced works of startling power and beauty, images that still move us 9,000 years later. It reminds us that art is not a luxury but a fundamental human need, a way of making sense of the world and our place in it. The settlement teaches us about continuity and change. For 1400 years the people of Çatalhöyük maintained a remarkably consistent way of life. The houses of the earliest periods are almost identical to the houses of the latest periods. The burial practices, the art, the tools, all show a deep conservatism, a commitment to tradition and continuity that is rare in human societies. And yet, beneath that surface stability, there was constant change. New houses were built on the ruins of old ones. Walls were replastered and repainted. People were born and died, and each generation had to learn anew the skills and knowledge that kept the community alive. The balance between continuity and change, between honoring the past and adapting to the present, is something every society must negotiate, and Çatalhöyük managed it for longer than most. But Çatalhöyük also leaves us with questions, mysteries that may never be fully solved. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know their names for themselves or for the place they lived. We do not know the songs they sang or the stories they told, the jokes they made or the dreams they had. We can reconstruct their material culture, the objects they made and used, but we cannot fully enter their minds, cannot know what it felt like to be them, to see the world through their eyes. This is the fundamental limitation of archaeology, the gap between the physical traces we can recover and the lived experience that created them. We do not know why the egalitarian system of Çatalhöyük did not become the template for later civilizations. Why did the path lead from this relatively equal community to the hierarchical states and empires that would dominate history? Was it inevitable, the result of forces we cannot control? Or was it a choice, a series of choices made by individuals and communities in response to specific circumstances? And if it was a choice, could we choose differently now? We do not know what the people of Çatalhöyük would think of us, of the world we have made, of the cities we have built with their towers of glass and steel, their millions of inhabitants, their staggering inequalities of wealth and power. Would they recognize us as their descendants, as people engaged in the same fundamental project of trying to live together in large numbers, or would we seem like aliens to them, our world so transformed as to be unrecognizable? It is a humbling thought, to imagine their perspective, to wonder what 9,000 years of history looks like from the vantage point of the past. Standing at the mound of Çatalhöyük today, you see a grassy hill rising above the flat expanse of the Konya plain. The wheat fields stretch to the horizon, dotted with modern villages. Tractors move slowly through the rows, and in the distance you can see the mountains, the same mountains that provided obsidian to the people who lived here so long ago. The protective shelters over the excavation areas glint in the sunlight, metal and plastic structures that would have been incomprehensible to the ancient inhabitants, but that exist to preserve their legacy, to protect what they built from the erosion of time. If you could descend beneath the earth, if you could move through the layers like moving backward through time, you would pass through millennia of accumulated soil and debris, through the Ottoman period and the Byzantine and the Roman, through ages of which the people of Çatalhöyük could not have dreamed. And eventually you would reach their level, the Neolithic, and you would find yourself in one of their houses, in the half-light filtering through a roof opening, in the presence of walls painted with bulls and vultures and leopards. You would be standing where they stood, breathing the same air they breathed, seeing what they saw. And for a moment the distance of 9,000 years would collapse, and you would understand, however briefly, what it meant to be human in the oldest city you have never heard of. The legacy of Çatalhöyük is not in monuments or inscriptions. It is in the very fact of its existence, in the proof it offers that humans can create communities of remarkable complexity and beauty without the trappings of power that we have come to see as inevitable. It is in the art on the walls and the bones beneath the floors, in the obsidian blades and the grinding stones, in every artifact that speaks to the daily labor and the creative spirit of people who lived and loved and struggled and died in a time before history was written down. It is in the questions it raises about how we choose to live together, about what we value and what we are willing to sacrifice, about the relationship between the individual and the community, between the present and the past, between the living and the dead. Çatalhöyük reminds us that civilization is not linear, that there is no single path from simplicity to complexity, from chaos to order. It reminds us that our ancestors were not primitive but sophisticated, not ignorant but wise in ways we have forgotten. It reminds us that the past is not dead but alive, not distant but present, waiting to speak to us if we have the patience to listen and the humility to learn. And so our story of Çatalhöyük comes to a close. We have walked through its houses, ground its grain, painted its walls, buried its dead. We have seen it rise from the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse, thrive for more than a millennium, and slowly fade as the environment degraded and the old ways became unsustainable. We have watched as it became a mound, silent and forgotten, and then rediscovered by archaeologists who have devoted their lives to understanding it. And we have tried, however inadequately, to imagine what it was like to live there, to be part of that ancient community, to experience the world as they experienced it. The night is deep now. The stars are turning in their courses, the same stars that shone down on Çatalhöyük 9,000 years ago. The settlement is gone, but its story remains, preserved in the earth and in the careful excavations of those who have uncovered it. And perhaps in some small way we carry that story with us. A reminder of what is possible when people come together with shared purpose and mutual respect, when they create not for glory or power, but for the simple joy of making a home, a community, a life worth living. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the deep past. Thank you for your curiosity and your patience, for your willingness to imagine a world so different from our own. As you drift towards sleep, let the images of Çatalhöyük accompany you, the painted walls and the rooftop paths, the obsidian mirrors and the buried ancestors, the rhythm of stone on stone and the smoke rising through the roof openings. Let them remind you that we are part of a long chain of being, that we are connected across time to people who faced the same fundamental questions we face, who sought meaning and purpose and community just as we do. Rest well, dream of distant ages, and remember that the past is not behind us but beneath us, supporting us, shaping us, waiting to teach us if we are willing to learn Until our next journey through the archives of history, good night.